time seeing it. One of the pleasures of this series is that we try to locate and forefront lost or abandoned or orphaned or seriously underscreened films and make them accessible again to see in a theatrical setting. And probably I would say 40 or 50% of the time when I see the movie, it's the first time I'm seeing it too. So my introduction tonight could maybe incorporate a few more details because I've actually seen the damn film. But having said that, the director of tonight's movie, called The Naked Fog, which we learned when we got the print because it had been called Naked Fog for many years, and then we finally saw the title on the film, is a man named Joseph Sarno, who died 10 years ago this year. He was a dear friend of mine, and I spent many years researching his career. And it was largely because of the work he did in New York in the 60s in an obscure genre still, for many people, an obscure genre called sexploitation movies, which is kind of a pre-pornographic, sexy film form that flourished in New York in the 60s. Largely through my interest in his work and the work of a few other filmmakers who worked in that milieu, I got interested in the larger independent feature production scene here in New York. Many people here are probably familiar with the New York Underground and the work of the avant-garde that this institution has done so much to perpetuate and keep alive. But at around the same time, if you left the Village and went up to 42nd Street, there was another kind of thriving, although much more commercial theatrical film context. And Joe was one of the principal pioneers of that genre, and I would say one of the greatest auteurs to work in it, and he truly was an auteur. He wrote and directed all of his films, and by the time Dirty Movies went entirely over to video production in the early 80s, he had written and directed 75 features, all of which were theatrically distributed and exhibited. Joe was a New Yorker. He was born in Brooklyn, but when he was a kid, his parents moved out to a big house in Amityville, Long Island. He lived very close to the Amityville Horror House. And a lot of this film was actually shot in Amityville. Joe liked to get out of New York for a variety of reasons when he was shooting movies, not always, but often when he needed exteriors. It wasn't so easy to shoot independent features in New York in the 1960s. There was no mayor's office assisting you with permits and friendly policemen. Actually, it was more like the cops were shaking you down and the unions were shaking you down and passers-by were waving to the camera, and it was a real pain in the butt. So he'd oftentimes go to Amityville when he wanted to shoot independently. There's a hardcore New Yorker. The film we're screening is from early-ish in Joe's career. His first feature is from the very early 60s, and I would say his film Sin in the Suburbs, released the year before he shot this film, was one of the first important sexploitation films that we've documented, played all over the country, and really created this sort of like a sense that there were a group of American-made films that were at the time compared to, quote, adult-oriented European features, but of course, being Americans, there was capital A adult, right? They loaded on much more. In fact, hi there, come on in. Some of the films actually produced in Europe that were imported to this country as adult-oriented with a little bit more nudity or slightly more sexual situations were actually augmented with insert footage shot here in New York to make them hotter than they actually had been when they were made in France or Sweden or Germany. Joe didn't do work like that, but the distributors and people he worked with were oftentimes doctoring films in that way. This film was, we know from an interview I did with the producer, and I think Gabe is still alive, isn't he, Peggy?
Who?
Gabe Sicali.
No.
No. This, by the way, is my dear, dear friend Peggy Stephan Sarno, who is Joe Sarno's wife. Maybe we can go. And this film was produced just about a year before you met Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Peggy was involved with many of Joe's films after that. Sin in the Suburbs was one of the first important sexploitation features. So people began to recognize there was money to be made in these features, and Joe was quickly conscripted by a variety of producers over the year to make films for them, which they then circulated through this growing matrix of sexploitation theaters, usually in downtown entertainment districts in cities all over the country, kind of like Times Square. This particular film, let's see, was number 9. For people who know Sarno's work, and there may be a couple of you here, it's a wonderful kind of a homecoming day for many actors and actresses you might have seen in other of his films. Joe loved to work with the same actors over and over again. He knew what they could do. He created kind of a repertory company that would shift over time. But there are a lot of really interesting folks in the film. Having seen it for the first time last night, I discovered people were in it that I didn't know were in it because they were using pseudonyms and I didn't know it was them, etc. So that's fun for me. Might not be fun for you. The film was shot by a man named Jerry Kalogorados, a Greek cinematographer who had studied in Italy. He shot several commercial features in Greece. I think he came to this country in light of a documentary film he had made that was being exhibited here in a festival, and he wound up settling here, working in the commercial industry, working for Madison Avenue, and got his first opportunity to shoot a film, to shoot a feature film working for Joe, and he made 3 films with Joe. He got this wonderful, very distinctive kind of spotlit, low-key lighting style. In fact, he told me, and Jerry is still alive because I talked to him recently, and he's certainly in his 90s, he would take tin foil and make these little snoots, right? This little tight little cone, so that he could just make these little spotlights on people's faces, which became very typical of Joe's style, I would say, over the years. So I think it was a meaningful contribution. Also, I interviewed her many years ago, and I hope she's doing well. She was living down in New Orleans, but the film was edited by a woman named Pat Fulmer, who also worked with Joe on a number of films at this time. He was very good at cultivating young talent, inspiring people. Sound people like Lee Dichter, who's become extremely well known in the sound recording industry, started working with Joe, other people in the camera department. Sexploitation was a place where young, talented people who were not in the union and had a hard time getting a job on a union feature could try their hands at camera work, at lighting and editing and sound work, and really get experience working on real 35mm features. So I hope you find the film to be interesting. I think maybe after watching it last night, the producer, who I know was a little bit of a meddler, and even edited some things after the fact, he might have moved a few things around. And I do know from a fellow who was an extra in the opening scene that the big topless dancing scene at the beginning of the movie, which is fairly uncharacteristic of Joe's work, was shot and added after the fact because the producer probably said we need more boobs in the movie, right? One thing I'll note, by the way, there's quite a bit of toplessness in that opening sequence. In late 1965, when it was first released, that was still pretty much verboten in the vast majority of films, particularly More Than a Little Flash. So one thing that the sexploiteers would do for a year or two before it became normalized to see toplessness in movies is they would insert a reel somewhere in the film, it helped to have it at the beginning, that could be pulled out if, you know, a theater decided that the local audience or local censorship authorities or, you know, whoever the civic fathers were would kind of come down on them if you showed all this. So the opening sequence was probably, the opening reel was probably totally deleted at certain screenings. And since it contributes in almost no way to the story, that's not a problem, right? And then the few other flashes of toplessness could be trimmed out if they had to be by projectionists. And there were stories about projection booths like the one behind you, all over the country for many years, had little snippets of film with boobs in them, taped to the wall by the projectionists. They never restored them to the prints. But I'm grateful to the folks who've digitized this print and made it available for this screening. The film was actually, was lost for over 50 years. The print that this transfer came from was sold on eBay. I bid on it and lost. But the people who won it turned out to be friends of mine who were also deeply interested in Joe's work, and they made it available. And so all's well that ends well, except they paid a lot more for it than I would have if I had bid against them. The last thing I'll say is within a few months of the discovery, the recovery of this film, I also learned from somebody else very involved in finding films within this milieu that the negative was also located. So the 35mm negative for the film, although it may not be the basis for a digital transfer for many years, is preserved and owned by people who will carefully care for it. So I think when I met Joe and Peggy 20-ish years ago now, I think I counted there's something like 35 of Joe's films were considered totally missing. Now we're just down to just a couple. So this is the first time in 55 years this film has been screened in a theater theatrically, and you're the first bunch of people who've been able to see it. So I hope you find the film interesting. And thanks for coming out on a snowy night. And if you get a chance to check out our next installment, we'll try to do something for Beyond Cassavetes in the near future. Okay? Enjoy the film. Thank you.